The first horror film I ever watched was American Werewolf. I remember the transformation scene vividly, and unlike my older cousin, who was traumatized by it, I loved it, and it got me hooked on the genre. I eat up everything horror, and do everything short of buying the Funkos, which in my opinion is a waste of money. Back when streaming wasn't a thing, I collected an entire wall of DVDs dedicated to horror films, from classics to foreign to cheesy movies. I just couldn't get enough of being scared. Now I read that horror stimulates the part of the brain that is primitive and hardly ever activated in modern times. Unlike our ancestors, we are on top of the food chain and rarely have to worry about being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or being wiped out by the flu. Because of this, horror films, videos, games, and even things like roller coasters are used vicariously so we can experience the fear of nearly dying, but not actually being in any real danger. Haunted houses are a prime example of this. Every year, during Halloween, these places become extremely competitive with each other, all trying to be scarier than the others. The problem is that people are sort of desensitized from horror, and it's not just from movies or television, but from the nightly news and media feeds. Mass shootings, patricide, abduction, natural disasters, and so much more. However, for fans of extreme horror, this is a blessing. For people like me, we live for this kind of stuff. Over the years, I've found a few like-minded people online and became real-life friends with them. We have a group chat where we share movie and book recommendations. We call ourselves Gorehounds. While we were always communicating, it was during the Halloween season that we would share the scariest haunted houses to visit. Most of the extreme haunted houses were not advertised to the public. Most of them were illegally set up to make it feel more dangerous, and the really good ones were set up in places that were already creepy and riddled with a sordid past. A hotel where a fire killed dozens of people, a warehouse where a serial killer tortured the homeless, things like that. This year, a member of the group told us about a new place, a place that she claimed would be crowned the best of the haunted houses, Goose Creek Sanatorium. After a quick search online, I found that Goose Creek Sanatorium had a dark history. It was abandoned in the late 70s due to a fire, and since then it just sat there, gathering dust and mold. The most recent thing I could find on it was a short article from a small newspaper that said it had been recently purchased. Other than that, there was nothing. The drive there took a few hours, but we've driven more than that over the years in our search of the scariest place. Unfortunately, there was little to see on the way, so for most of the drive, I slept. When I woke up, it was nearly dark and the car was rocking on a dirt road that hasn't been maintenance for decades. The trees that hugged the road covered the sky like skeletal fingers. It looked like the perfect place for a scary movie. Goose Creek Sanatorium was a large 5-story building that saw no upkeep in decades. Surrounding it was a black iron fence to keep its patients from getting away. Very little had been done to make the place spookier. The people who put it up knew this and didn't want to ruin it with many decorations. To me, this made sense. After all, a little salt goes a long way when cooking, and too much will spoil the meat. The same is true when decorating a place that is already creepy. The line to get in only had a few people in it. Like us, they were horror connoisseurs. We knew some of them from the other extreme, haunted houses we'd visited over the years, and this time we invited some of them to be members of our group chat. Like those other places, we had to sign a waiver. This allowed the workers to grab us, pull hair, and more. Getting into the main building required us to walk through a garden that was overgrown with weeds and littered with broken statues of angels that were covered with moss from years of neglect. Like the rest of the place, not much had been done in order to make it creepy. Before entering the building, one of the workers grabbed Rena, one of the founding members of the Gorehounds, and ran off with her over his shoulders. This caused everyone to laugh, including Rena, as she was being taken further away. "Bring her back when you're done with her, Aaron," Rita's boyfriend called out while laughing. At the entrance of the building was a so-called tour guide who was dressed like a ghoul who just crawled out of a grave. A man wearing a jacket and shorts asked why an extreme haunted house would need a tour guide, but the guide just smiled and said that everything would be explained later on the tour. He explained the history of the place as he led us through each of the rooms. Most of the rooms didn't have anyone jump out and grab us, because they didn't require any. The history of the building was terrifying, so we did not need to resort to embellishment. Not only were there mentally ill treated like animals here, but Goose Creek Sanatorium also housed people with tuberculosis, and they were equally mistreated. Whenever someone died, they were brought to the basement's crematorium by being dropped down a dumbwaiter made for corpses. According to the guide, the smokestacks that were connected to the crematorium in the basement would have to be cleaned out every month because the remains would stick to the wall. That job was given to one of the other inmates because of how damaging it was to people's lungs. If someone died while doing it, they would simply be added to the chimney's ashes. While others in the group thought that the story was bullshit, I believed every word of it because of the horrible things I discovered online about the place. After this introduction, we headed to the cells. As soon as we left the lobby, iron bars in the doorway dropped, preventing us from leaving that way. The sound of heavy, metallic clanging was deafening and caused us to jump out of our skins. The guide chuckled when Goose Creek Sanatorium was first constructed. The biggest fear was that someone would escape. That's why there are bars in each of the doorways and windows. That wasn't anything I read while doing my research, but it sort of made sense. After all, this place used to house the worst criminals and lunatics the state had to offer. In the cells, people were reaching out to us on both sides of the hallway, moaning and screaming. Some pulled us towards them, and we would do our best to avoid their hands, or just slap them away. While this was going on, the tour guide told us about some of the famous murderers who once lived here. The most famous of them was Solomon Gideon, who killed 13 people in a day. He called Goose Creek Sanatorium home for 10 years before the mysterious fire that caused the place to close down allowed him to escape. Where he went is still a mystery. I could talk for days about Solomon Gideon, but that story's for another day. While being told all of this, a man wearing a dirty surgical mask came out of one of the hallways, grabbed someone I didn't get the name up by their hair, and dragged him away. The man being dragged away tried to fight him off, but the masked man not only had the element of surprise, but he was also very physically imposing. Because of this, no one stepped in to help. All we did was look on helplessly. We all signed up for this, after all. As we left the cells, more bars fell, preventing us from leaving the way we came. Deeper into the bowels of the sanatorium, we came across what I assume used to be the mess hall. When we walked in, it seemed to me that the inmates had taken control of the asylum. Hanging from the ceiling was wet meat hanging on hooks and cages. Inside the cages were people begging for our help. The guide spoke over their cries and told us more about the history of the place, how the doctors were known to perform experimental surgeries. When someone in the group asked if they meant lobotomies, the guide smiled and said, while those did happen in Goose Creek, there were far worse fates. Rooms were constructed with the sole purpose of driving insane men sane. The idea was that if something could make a sane man insane, it could have the opposite effect. This included flashing lights, prolonged darkness, sensory deprivation, being wet, cold, and hot. The people who had to endure this were even starved, the guide said as we left. Again, more bars fell down, preventing our escape. And I would be lying if I said I wasn't scared by this. Now our next stop was one of the operation rooms where blood had been spattered all around, making the place look and smell more like a charnel house than a hospital. I didn't think much of this. After all, it isn't uncommon for extreme haunted houses to use ground beef and the blood that comes with it as decoration. The guide told us to look around, and that we would meet back up at the surgery room in 30 minutes. We stayed in small groups, and wandered around a little, all the while having our hair and clothes pulled by people wanting to be freed. Their makeup is Hollywood level, Andrew said, pointing out someone who looked to have been captive for weeks. She was so thin. I assumed that she was a recovering drug addict or a method actor, and her dirty white dress highlighted the fact that she was pale as a ghost. The more we explored, the less we saw the other groups with us. Occasionally, we heard screaming, but we couldn't be certain that it came from them or the actors locked away in their cells. After 20 minutes or so went by, I noticed that the guide was nowhere in sight. I was concerned about this, but the rest of the people in my group assumed it was just part of the show. He abandoned us so we would have to escape on our own, Aaron said as he started making his way back the way we came, forgetting about the iron bars. Making our way back to where we last saw the guide, we looked for an escape route. At the time, we were relieved. After all, up to this point, it wasn't overly scary. Now that we were left to find our own way out, we felt that it was about to get good. We spread out to look for a way out, but kept close enough to each other so we could hear if one of us called out. After a while, I came across a dark hallway that had 6 different directions to go, including the way I came from. Calling out to the rest of the gorehounds, we met in this grand intersection of hallways. Some of us wondered why the hallways were designed like that, but Andrew was quick to scout ahead and find a way out. Before he could open the door at the end of the hallway he chose, one of the women from the other group barreled past the door and ran by us. She didn't even try to stop or explain herself, and the look on her face was pure horror. Under usual circumstances, we would have followed her just as quickly, but we came here to get scared, so we went in the direction she came from. After all, we had to know what made her freak out like that. We couldn't see much in the dark room, but there was an echo and the floor was sticky. Somewhere close was the sound of shallow gasps. We had to feel around to navigate our way through. On the way, we got separated, made worse when some of the actors came into the room with night vision goggles and took some of our hands, as if they were in our group, and led us away from the others and the exit. By the time the few of us discovered that half the gorehounds were no longer with the rest, we were in the next room, a surgery room made to host an audience. The smell of fresh blood was unmistakable. In the middle of the room was the body of one of the people in the other group. She was tied to the operating table, and the surgeon who appeared earlier in the cells was standing over her. Some of us freaked out when we saw this, but Debbie assured us that it was all part of the show, that we were looking at a dummy, and the person we met in line was a plant to make the experience feel real. As she said this, I inwardly applauded. We all had experienced extreme horror houses before, but never came across anything like that before. In the distance, there was the sound of someone yelling over a bullhorn, "Stay where you are, don't come any closer," and more instructions. There were even a few gunshots. We all froze, wondering if this was part of the show too. If it was, it didn't fit the rest of the experience. The surgeon aimed his scalpel at us and warned us not to move before running out the door towards the shooting. Naturally, I don't listen, and went to look out into the hallway he went through. I thought this was all just part of the show. However, when the surgeon started stabbing the officers before getting gunned down, I knew it was real. After the raid, and the police took everyone's statements, we were let go. They promised to do all they could to find Rena and the others that went missing, but after 2 years, we don't have much hope in finding them alive. In the days that followed, details of what happened emerged. In the 10 days the haunted house was up, 36 people went missing, and at least 14 were murdered. The man responsible for the haunted house was best friends with the shady prison warden, and the two of them had a deal that the warden would supply prisoners to make the horror experience authentic for an unspecific amount of cash. Those acquired from the prison included 8 murderers and 10 violent offenders. The worst of it, though, was a known cult leader who would dine on the blood of his sacrifices and must have recruited the others. Why this person ever saw the light of day is a mystery to me. 7 of these people were killed in the raid, and the rest are among the missing, including the man who paid off the warden. Aaron killed himself a few weeks after that night. I think he blamed himself for laughing as they took Rena. The Gorehounds broke up soon after that. Nothing officially. It's just that we no longer update each other on horror movies or other haunted houses. I sort of talk to Debbie, but never about anything horror related. Most of the time we hang out, we silently fish or drink. I can't speak for the others, but I cannot bring myself to watch horror anymore. This happened to me when I was 4 years old. It's been 30 years, but I remember it like it was yesterday. There are many strange occurrences in this house, but this is the one that started everything. Some backstory. My entire family has lived in the same small southeast Kansas town for 4 generations. My mother grew up there and moved away with her mother when she was around 15. A year later, she was involved in a very tragic car accident, where she was the only survivor. After waking up from a month-long coma, there was a lawsuit against the company who owned the other vehicle, and my mom won a large settlement. Shortly after the lawsuit, my mother was whisked back to the small Kansas town by her father. It wasn't long before my mother was back in high school, met my father, and was pregnant with me. By the time she was 17, she had married my father and graduated from high school. They bounced around from small house to apartment to another small house. In a town of 1,000 people, there isn't much to choose from. Eventually, they got sick of the roach-filled slums and decided to use the money my mom had to buy a house. As with the rental side of things, houses were somewhat tough to come by. Most homes are family-owned and have been in the families for decades. But they did find one house available for sale. The house they settled on was a 2-story home across the street from the high school. It was built in the 1800s, when the streets in town were either dirt or brick. As with any big, creepy old house next to a high school, people talked about it, but none of my parents' friends had ever actually been inside. When my mom viewed it, she found it to be absolutely beautiful. She instantly spent most of her settlement on the house and purchased it in her name alone. My mom, dad, and 3-year-old self moved in shortly after. Less than a year later, my parents divorced and my dad moved out. My mom and I ended up living there, mostly alone, for the next 9 years. I know this is going a bit long, but it's important to understand the layout of the home, for this and almost all the stories of my paranormal experiences happen here. You open the front door to a large staircase in the middle of the home. On the left was a small living room area, and on the right was a larger living room-esque space bisected by what was once a double doorway. But now the door is missing. The bathroom was under the stairs, which led to the one downstairs bedroom. Spanning the back of the home was the kitchen and laundry room, which was clearly once a back porch. Upstairs was a bit strange. The staircase, being in the center of the house, led almost to the back of the home. At the top of the stairs, there was a bedroom to the right, which was mine, and to the left, a long hallway. In the middle of the long hallway was a door to another bedroom, my mother's, and at the end was a room we called the balcony room. Now, for my first paranormal experience, and like I said, the one to start them all. It was a cool fall night in 1994. My mom and I had been at her friend's house, Jay. For most of the evening, they'd listened to Nirvana or whatever edgy music was popular back then. She was 21 and into partying, dumber than a box of rocks, and had no problem dragging me along through all of her issues. But that's another story. I remember having a good time with her and all of her friends. They usually treated me pretty well, so I had a good time hanging out late into the night. But around 2 or 3 a.m., it was time for us to go home. We pulled into our home after a short 10-minute drive. The garage was about 100 feet from the back of the house, and we could see our bedroom lights shining through the lace curtains in the upstairs windows. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary or strange at all. We walked up the small porch to the back door that led to the laundry room, both yawning and ready to go to sleep. Once inside, the light from the large living room shined through the open doorway into the kitchen, We walked through the kitchen and into the living room, and that's when we heard it. Footsteps somewhere inside the house. We peered into the living room, but couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Mom called out, "Hello?" No response. Just footsteps. Mom and I made the trek to the front of the house, stopping near the foot of the stairs. The light from the living room bled over to the bottom few stairs, into the smaller living room on the other side. Unfortunately, the upstairs hallway light had been out since we moved in. That's why we typically left the bedroom lights on, so the light could bleed into the hallway. But looking up the staircase was looking into complete darkness. Someone had turned off the lights to the bedroom and was running around upstairs. Mom called out again, "Hello, who's there?" Of course, no response again. The footsteps were getting more intense. Like most old houses, when something is dropped or someone is stomping around, you feel it everywhere. We were starting to feel those footsteps as they were turning into stomps. One last time, my mom called out, "Who's running around up there?" And for a split second, the footsteps stopped. Then the stomping started. I could feel the stomps walking down the hallway towards the top of the stairs, and they started almost running down the staircase. My mom and I stood, knowing that whoever was running in our home was about to reveal themselves by stepping into the light. I remember feeling them stomping in the floor, getting closer with every step. The stomping stopped right at the foot of the stairs. Nothing was there. It seemed like an eternity that Mom and I both stood there, staring at the last step. But I'm sure it was only a second. Then, as quickly as it stopped, the stomping started again, backing up the stairs, around the banister, and down the hallway. Once we snapped out of it, my mom picked me up and ran back to the car. She backed out of the driveway and went back to Jay's house. Once we got there, Mom told Jay what we had seen. "There's no way. Someone's messing with you, Jen," he said. She begged him to come back to the house, to see it for himself. And he agreed. We pulled up to the front of the house, this time not even bothering with the back door. I'm sure Mom expected us to open the door and everything to be completely normal. Jay would laugh at the situation, and we'd take him home. I know that's what I expected. But that's not what happened at all. Jay opened the door first, and we walked in, standing at the foot of the stairs, just where Mom and I had been 20 minutes ago. We heard the same stomps from before. Instantly, Jay said, "Watch, we're going to go outside and find the ladder they used to climb into your house. We'll pull it down and they'll have to reveal themselves." We went outside, of course, and no ladder or any other way that someone could have broken in could be found. We went back inside, and it all happened again, all the way to the bottom of the stairs, right in front of Mom, Jay, and myself. "How about you guys stay at my place tonight?" We all spent the night at Jay's house. The next morning, we went back. The sunlight was shining in, illuminating the upstairs hallway. When we made it to the top of the stairs, everything was normal. Nothing was misplaced, no windows broken or even left open. Everything was exactly how we left it. Jay Burr didn't come around Mom's very much after that. I guess it's hard to blame him. Mom and I spoke about this happening in the days following the event. Up until we moved out, she tried to play it off as if it was some joke. She seemed scared by the event, and in an effort to protect me from the truth, always denied or downplayed any experiences I shared with her in the future. It wasn't until several years after we'd left the house that she finally opened up to me about her experiences and admitted that it was haunted. I still don't think she was ever fully honest. This is one of my earliest childhood memories. I was just a little guy back then, and I didn't really understand what had happened to me. I just knew that it wasn't normal. Little did I know, this was the first of many paranormal experiences I would have in this home. Stick around to the channel, and I might share part 2 here soon. An odd-looking man had been pounding on the plastic barrier at the check-in desk while we were in the waiting room. Shouting what sounded like a string of nonsense at the poor hospital employee behind it. I was reaching that weird twilight state where the sedatives make everything seem slightly surreal. The pictures in the magazine I was holding seemed to be moving, and I was pointing them out to my wife, Marianne, who suppressed a laugh in response. I was a bit out of it, but I do remember that he was screaming something along the lines of that he was very sick, and that something was in his body with him, and they needed to get it out. As she led me out of the waiting room, my nurse cheerfully explained the procedure to me, while wearing the brightest smiley face scrubs I'd ever seen. I shot one look back to Marianne, because despite the waiting room being nearly empty, the yelling guy had sat down right next to her and stared at her while he kept rubbing his eyes. She smiled at me, giving me her "I'll be fine" look, and pulled out the well-worn paperback she had brought with her. Once we got past the door, there was a young woman in a hospital bed. She smiled at me serenely, but there was something weird about her that I couldn't put my finger on. Maybe the way she stared at me without blinking, or how she breathed in odd, exaggerated breaths. It was almost as if she was trying to demonstrate to those around her that she was truly an authentic, living, breathing person. She stared at me with what looked to be curling, delicate black threads emerging from behind her eye sockets, but I chalked that up to the sedation meds at the time. I don't remember much about the scan itself. I'm not sure how long I had been trapped in there for, but it was late morning when I went in, and pitch black outside when I came out. I had come to, in the dark and tight space, to the gentle whirring sound of the machine. There were no doctors, nurses, or technicians in my room, and the lights were off. It was eerily silent. I hadn't realized where I was at first, and squirmed in my post-sedation stupor. I instinctively tried to sit up, and my nose made hard contact with the inside of the machine. They had been kind enough to approve sedating me for the hour-and-a-half-long scan due to my claustrophobia, but then apparently they had just forgotten about me. I pounded on the inside of the awful white tunnel and screamed until I was hoarse, and still no one came for me. At one point, I felt someone tugging me. Cold and clammy hands pulled indelicately at my ankles. But they must have given up, because not long afterwards, I was alone again. I would have thought the whole memory was a fabrication of my drugged mind, but there was an odd, grayish residue on my ankles when I finally got up. I thought of Marianne, sitting in the waiting room, and I didn't know how everyone could have forgotten about me. Surely she would have asked about me when several hours had passed and I still hadn't returned. Eventually, I calmed down enough to release the belt and slowly inch my way out, trying to keep my eyes shut and breathing steadily, not focusing on the fact that my face was so close to the inside of the tunnel that I could feel my own breath reflected back onto my face. I tried to ignore the friction burns as I accidentally struck bare flesh against the smooth interior. In the distance, awful screaming, like I had never heard before, seamlessly transitioned into laughter. Laughter that was so odd it gave me chills. It floated down the silent hallway. At one point, as I walked towards the elevator, I thought I saw small and perfectly round eyes gleaming at me from behind the glass panel in one of the darkened rooms. I told myself it was the last of the drugs in my system, messing with my head. That was why the elevator buttons looked to be painted with still drying blood as they lit up. I assured myself, just the meds. I stumbled back the way that I remember the nurse leading me, until I saw something that made me stop cold. The handprints told a story, sloppily written in blood, on what used to be an off-white floor. Pull, drag. From following the uneven and messy tracks, I guess that someone had been hauling themselves down the hallway, using their hands while the rest of them dragged along the dingy linoleum, leaving streaky crimson in their wake. The hallway was littered with what looked like long black hairs that seemed to be moving ever so slightly. At this point, I really hoped that I was just hallucinating. It began from the path to the waiting room, and then continued to the hall that forked away from me. There was so much blood, I didn't know how the person was even able to keep going that far. The smell was overwhelming. I had accidentally stepped into it, and could feel the still warm liquid as it seeped into my hospital-issued socks. I still couldn't blink both my eyes. But those very real feeling sensations, coupled with the absolute lack of people and symphony of beeps and alerts coming from the rooms on either side of the narrow hall, made it harder and harder to convince myself that I was simply drugged out of my mind. Somehow, despite all the other noise, I could still hear the faint, wet dragging sound of someone crawling through the darkness. I was a bit woozy and desperate to get out, so I called out into the distance that I was going to get help. The sound of raw meat dragging along the floor paused for just a few moments before resuming. I realized it seemed to grow louder, almost as if it had changed direction and were now heading back towards me. In that moment, I felt dread gnawing at me, and suddenly, I didn't want them to reach me. I felt that something terrible would happen if they did. After heading away from the increasingly loud, wet crawling sound in the hallway, I continued my trek back towards the waiting room. The moist socks left bloody footprints in my wake. The pattern confirmed that I was still weaving a bit as I walked. If I were here alone, I probably would have hauled ass out of the emergency exit door as soon as I saw the blood and whatever that was lurking in the darkness on the floor below. But I could see Mary Ann's lime green hatchback in the parking lot through a window in the hallway. She was still inside. Even though the trail led from the waiting room, the person crawling through the empty hallway was not my wife. I told myself anyways. She was fine. She'd be sitting right where I'd seen her last, in the waiting room. Some of the doors to the occupied rooms were just slightly ajar, and I tried to ignore the sounds coming from within them. I finally came across the nurse's station that I had remembered being the last thing between myself and the secured doors. But what I saw there quickly killed any relief that had been forming. There were feet sticking out from just behind the counter. They moved and twitched irregularly. Despite my better judgment, I stepped over the mess of gore in the hallway to take a closer look. The legs seemed to dance to an unearthly melody that only the owner could hear. I saw my nurse, the one who had taken me back for the scan. I was so out of it before that I'd forgotten her name, but not her smile that matched the smiley faces on her trippy neon scrubs. The smile was long gone now. There was still a jagged bit of ribs and torso left above the hip bone and both legs, but the rest of her was just missing. I stared in horror. It took me a moment for my eyes to adjust and see the macabre dance that was resulting of something moving around just inside the gaping wound in what was left of her torso. I could see many of the now familiar, delicate hair-like threads spilling out of her body. They moved in unison, and it almost looked as if the small tendrils were beginning to reform the parts of her body that were missing. It was like watching an otherworldly 3D printer for flesh and bone. I clamped my hand over my mouth tightly to keep quiet, and took a last, long, sad look at the blood-soaked scrubs and the flailing legs. I sped up and continued onwards clumsily. Despite what I'd told myself, I almost couldn't believe it when I found Mary Ann, still sitting on a now sticky and saturated chair in the waiting room. Her sweater was slashed in places and stained. An entire arm of the sweater was missing. Splatters and small droplets speckled her cheeks, and the cover of the book she was holding was now upside down, but she looked entirely uninjured. I had a fleeting moment where I wondered where the blood around her had come from, but I didn't care. I was relieved more than anything. The room was in disarray, and a single sneaker, with a foot still in it, peeked out from under her chair. But she didn't even seem remotely fazed by the carnage around her. She stared at me for a moment, almost as if she had to flip through mental flashcards before she recognized me. But I figured it was due to whatever horrible things she had recently bore witness to. On our way out, I heard tapping behind the plastic panel at the check-in desk. Now I made the mistake of looking and saw the young hospital employee from before, gripping the desk desperately, trying to stay upright. His face, which was devoid of any emotion, looked misshapen, as if someone had tried to put together a human face, having never seen one before. Those thin, black tendril-like threads emerged from his eyes, and the cavernous gap where his lower jaw should have been. They were weaving together and seamlessly blending into his skin before my very eyes, repairing what likely should have been lethal injuries. We were so close to the exit when I heard the double doors move and ducked behind some chairs. I tried to pull Marianne down with me, but she stood firm. Shoes and the tattered stained hems of brightly colored, smiley-faced scrubs came into my view. It seemed as if my poor nurse had simply gotten up and strolled away, unperturbed by the minor inconvenience that the entire top third of her body was missing. My wife stared, but didn't react at all to whatever she was witnessing. Eventually, what remained of my nurse walked out the front doors and disappeared into the darkness beyond the lights of the parking lot. We eventually made it back to our car, but I can't drive yet, and she's just sitting in the driver's seat, staring at me without blinking, still and quiet except for an occasional loud, irregular breath. I swear I see delicate threads spilling from under her eyes. I've called 911, but keep getting dispatchers in the next county over. They keep routing me back to my own county, but no one is answering. I miss the moment when I thought waking up after a full-body MRI was going to be the worst part of my day. My wife has been acting so weird since my MRI. We're still sitting here. I'm tired, confused, and have the worst itching forming behind my eyes.